But got a bit to talk about here. So welcome everyone who's just joined in. My name's Mary. I'm the health educator here at our organization, and you'll see me behind these webinars from time and time again. Today we are focusing on eating more plants for healthier joints, and I'm seeing a few familiar names in this session from last week's webinar. And so hopefully everyone's watched that and got a bit of context in the anti-inflammatory nutrition space, because this session is intended to build on that. We cover a lot about anti-inflammatory nutrition. I just want to start with a acknowledgement of traditional owners. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I just want to put out a disclaimer to everyone that these sessions do cover very general information and advice. So we do go through the effort extensively to make sure everything's evidence-based, it's up-to-date information, it's in line with clinical guidelines. So what we're sharing with you is accurate and it is reliable, but it's not intended to substitute any individual treatment advice. Sometimes questions come in relating to your individual treatment plans, medications. I will always direct you to your primary healthcare physician or your GP, but I'll do my best to help you out with any questions if they arise. So welcome to everyone who's just joined in. If you have any questions, please pop them straight into the chat box and we'll have plenty of time at the end of the session to revisit those. But before I get into it, I'm interested to throw you guys a pop quiz question. How many different foods should we be eating a week? Does anyone know the question answer to this? Feel free to pop it in the chat or have a guess. Can play the prices right. 7 by 7, 5, 20. Okay. In fact, I will cover this shortly, but we should be having at least 30 different plant foods a week. So it sounds like a lot, but hopefully today what we can take away from the messages and information is how to actually incorporate that in our own dietary patterns. So today's session, we will be covering the gut microbiome and arthritis. I think it's a really important a part to the puzzle here. So we'll be going through what that means, how it relates to arthritic diseases, plants and pains. We're going to take a look at where the current evidence reliably points. We're going to go through some principles of the blue zones and the Mediterranean diet. I'm sure you've all heard about those from time and time again, and talk about some realistic practical changes that we can be making every day. So it's all well and good to go through theory and the research, but I like to focus more on how we can actually do that. How can we get this plant-based nutrition into our everyday lives? So let's take a step back. Let's start with a dive into the gut microbiome and arthritis connection. And so what I want to say is the gut microbiome is incredibly sensitive to the foods we eat. So this essentially means our diet can have a big impact on it. Why this matters in the context of arthritis is because the gut is home to trillions of bacteria that actually play a very crucial and a complex role in health. So some of these bacteria are very beneficial. That actively support things like digestion, immunity, our metabolic health, and overall well-being. Some bacteria are commensal, meaning they coexist with us without causing any kind of disruption or harm. But then you also have opportunistic or harmful bacteria that are known contributors to inflammation and disease if they become too dominant. So in the context of rheumatoid arthritis, we're actually starting to learn more about this link here. So with people who have rheumatoid arthritis, even those at high risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis, have a different mix of gut bacteria compared to people without rheumatoid arthritis. Some bacteria are present in higher amounts, and we're talking the opportunistic or harmful bacteria. And some of the beneficial bacteria are reduced, and that's a common observation across these groups of people. So in 2025, a type of genetic study called a Mendelian randomization control trial helps strengthen this link. So it suggested that gut bacteria may actually play a role in increasing the risk of rheumatoid arthritis, meaning these bacteria aren't just innocent bystanders, but part of the process driving the disease. And there have been animal studies that support this idea. So when researchers transferred gut bacteria from people with rheumatoid arthritis into mice that were already susceptible to arthritis, those mice developed more inflammation and more severe arthritis. So, what this is telling us is that the gut microbes can directly influence immune activity and joint inflammation. So, overall, the gut microbiome it isn't just associated with rheumatoid arthritis, it may actively contribute to how the disease um, develops and progresses. In the context of osteoarthritis, reviews of pretty much reviews up to 2025 suggest that the changes in gut bacteria increase the production of substances we know to be called endotoxins, which are essentially inflammatory substances that leak into the bloodstream. At the same time, we may see changes in short chain fatty acids, which are normally protective in the body and help regulate inflammation. So, pretty much, there's all these changes that have been observed in people with osteoarthritis, and it suggested they may contribute to low grade whole body inflammation. It's over time, the inflammation may play a role in cartilage breakdown, increased pain sensitivity, and even related conditions like obesity and metabolic syndrome. So we know these things tie in with the worsening of osteoarthritis symptoms. We're just starting to understand how the gut plays into that. So a similar gut joint link is being described in spondyloarthritis, with many people with this condition showing an imbalance in gut bacteria and even mild gut inflammation without those obvious digestive symptoms. And so a lot of the questions that come back to us is, well, how does this relate to what we eat? And so we know added sugars and processed foods often feed harmful bacteria. And these, sorry guys, I'm just letting some people into the room. These bacteria particularly thrive on sugar and low fiber foods. So examples of these kind of foods might be white bread, white plain pasta, noodles, low fiber cereals. So we're talking ultra processed foods. When these bacteria are well fed, not only do they multiply, but it's when they start outnumbering the beneficial bacteria, it becomes tricky. A healthy gut microbiome thrives on diversity. So the more variety of beneficial bacteria you have, the more your gut may be able to help protect against some of the inflammatory processes in the body and severity of symptoms. So whilst we can point the fingers at certain foods, what's really important to know is that the research around diet and inflammation is more pointing towards the overall dietary patterns or themes. So, if you want to get the anti-inflammatory benefits from the diet, we need to look at what we're having from morning to night every day. So, the evidence that the gut microbiome changes contribute to rheumatoid arthritis and possibly osteoarthritis, it is growing. So when we look at why certain dietary patterns may help in arthritis by way of nurturing the gut microbiome, there are a few proposed mechanisms at play. So firstly, lowering saturated fat is a big one. It's suggested this might help with reducing inflammatory signaling in the body. Diets high in saturated fats and particularly processed meats and fatty animal products have been shown to activate pro-inflammatory pathways and increase the production of inflammatory mediators. So in addition, there is a substance in a type of fat, it's called arachidonic acid. This type of fat is found in high concentrations in red meat and certain animal foods. So pretty much it serves as a building block for inflammatory molecules involved in pain and joint inflammation. By reducing these dietary inputs, we may modestly lower the body's overall inflammatory load. And so this isn't a cure, but it can form part of a broader strategy to create a less inflammatory internal environment, which is particularly relevant in joint conditions. Secondly, we know that increasing fiber and polyphenols is incredibly important when it comes to reducing inflammation and even preventing chronic diseases like heart disease and type 2 diabetes. Fiber isn't just about keeping us regular, keeping those bowel movements constant. It actually feeds the trillions of bacteria living in our gut. So when these the bacteria ferment fiber, they actually produce substances called short chain fatty acids. These short chain fatty acids help calm inflammation, support the immune system, strengthen the gut lining, and play a role in what we call the gut joint axis. It's basically a communication pathway between the gut health and joint health. So, in other words, when we nourish the gut bacteria with fiber, we're indirectly supporting healthier joints. And then you have the polyphenols. So, natural plant compounds found in foods like berries, extra virgin olive oil, tea, legumes. Imagine deeply colored vegetables. These polyphenols act as antioxidants in the body and are able to influence inflammatory pathways. So, another mechanism supposedly involves improving the balance of fats, specifically achieving a better omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So, diets richer in omega-3s and olive oil, which is very rich in omega-9s, and diets low in processed seed oils and saturated fat appear to shift the inflammatory environment towards a more regulated state. And finally, we can't ignore those metabolic effects. So weight loss, improved sensitivity of insulin, better lipid profiles, all have benefits in reducing systemic inflammation. In osteoarthritis, less weight means less mechanical load and force on joints. In inflammatory arthritis, improved metabolic health may help with lowering disease activity, potentially helping achieve remission. So whilst it's suggested that maintaining a high fiber, plant-rich diet, limiting ultra-processed foods, and managing weight and metabolic health appear supportive of a healthier microbiome, it still doesn't replace standard therapies. And this is just because the evidence isn't there yet. So we always look at it as an adjunct. It's something, when we talk about nutrition, it's basically another tool in your toolbox. So what I want to do is take a look at where the current evidence lies and what we know so far. And so I want to start with osteoarthritis and the current evidence for reducing saturated fats. The evidence is modest. Overall, it is stronger for symptom improvement as opposed to structural change. There have been many animal models done, and it's shown that some saturated fats have been shown to upregulate some of the enzymes that are involved in breaking down cartilage. In these models, it suggested that this could potentially promote osteoarthritis-like changes. In human data, prospective knee osteoarthritis cohort studies suggest high saturated fat intake is associated with faster radiographic progression. So while diet isn't the sole driver of structural change, this research is suggesting that higher saturated fat intake appears to contribute to a more degradative joint environment that can be observed in radiographic images. As for rheumatoid arthritis, the strength of evidence is stronger. So it sits in the moderate range. We have a lot of human trials on this topic as well. And so human trials have shown saturated fat can upregulate general inflammatory pathways in the body, even in healthy adults. So we know intake of saturated fats have systemic inflammatory effects. specifically in rheumatoid arthritis, anti-inflammatory diet interventions that have focused on reducing arachidonic acid intake, dropping from around 170 milligrams per day in a typical Western diet pattern to close to 50 milligrams per day, have shown meaningful clinical improvements. So these have included fewer tender joints, fewer swollen joints, and lower overall disease severity. If you're wondering how that translates to a real example involving food, dropping this intake might have been a result of swapping beef burgers for lentil or chickpeas burgers, replacing bacon and eggs for breakfast with oats, nuts, and berries, or choosing beans or tofu instead of chicken several nights per week. It was really important that the arachidonic acid was reduced. So what's worth mentioning is that these benefits were seen even without the addition of fish oil, suggesting that reducing these pro-inflammatory fats may have real therapeutic value. So overall, the dietary fat story appears more robust in rheumatoid arthritis, but it's still clinically relevant in osteoarthritis, particularly if we're talking about symptoms and disease progression risk. So if we're talking about fiber, this is where things get really interesting. For rheumatoid arthritis, the strength of evidence for increasing fiber is described as moderate to strong, and it's still emerging in some areas, but very promising. There was large population data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey that was facilitated between 2010 and 2020. It showed that people with higher fiber intake had lower prevalence of rheumatoid arthritis, lower levels of C-reactive protein, which is a very typical marker of systemic inflammation in the body. In a couple of intervention studies, even short-term high-fiber dietary interventions showed measurable biological changes. Now, there are a few reasons why these biological changes could have been observed. It could have been because of the increase in short chain fatty acid production, again, which are the beneficial metabolites that are produced by the gut, and they also help with regulating immune function. In these studies, this is why findings suggest that high fiber intake could be linked with improvements in the patient-reported outcomes, which is really important, such as pain and disease activity. So mechanistically and clinically, fiber appears to play a really meaningful role here. As for osteoarthritis, the strength of evidence is moderate to weak, but again, it's quite compelling. So there were two major cohort studies where we're talking about the Osteoarthritis Initiative and the Framingham Offspring Study. Researchers here found that the people in the highest quartile of fiber intake had a significantly lower risk of developing symptomatic knee osteoarthritis compared to those in the lowest quartile. When we say symptomatic knee osteoarthritis, we mean both pain and radiographic structural changes. In the Osteoarthritis Initiative, the odds ratio demonstrated a 30% lower risk. In the Framingham cohort, it was even stronger, so closer to a 60% lower risk. Across 4 to 9 years of follow-up, higher baseline fiber intake was also associated with a lower risk of developing knee pain, stiffness, and swelling. So while fiber isn't reversing structural changes, it does seem to have an influence on the symptoms positively. But before we do move on here, I want to acknowledge that fiber really isn't a one size fits all, and this has been apparent in the questions coming through. For people living with celiac disease, getting enough fiber in could be considered a real challenge, but adequate fiber is absolutely achievable on a gluten-free diet. One of the most common issues we see here is that many of those packaged gluten-free products are lower in fiber, so intake can drop without even realizing it. Similarly, for people with diverticular disease, during an acute diverticulitis flare, lower fiber may be recommended temporarily, but in stable phases, gradually increasing fiber is encouraged to help prevent the reoccurrence. So the key words here are gradual and individualized. This is where I really emphasize on the importance of connecting with an accredited practicing dietitian or a qualified nutrition professional. They're the ones who can help you personalize your fiber targets, adjust for celiac disease or diverticular history, and help you increase the intake safely while supporting your arthritis management and goals. So just on omega-3 fatty acids, the next food group that gets a lot of attention. For rheumatoid arthritis, strength of evidence here is moderate. There was a meta-analysis that looked at doses of at least 2.7 grams per day for 3 months or longer. What was observed was a clear reduction in NSAID use. So we're talking Nurofen, anti-inflammatory over-the-counter medications. That's clinically meaningful because if someone can reduce their reliance on anti-inflammatories, it suggests a real biological impact here. There were also trends towards improvements in tender and swollen joint counts, morning stiffness, although not all outcomes reached statistical significance across every study. In addition, a classic 12-month randomized control trial used around 2.6 grams per day of omega-3 showed significant improvements in both patient and physician pain assessments. So in rheumatoid arthritis, omega-3s appear to have genuine anti-inflammatory effects that translate into symptom improvement, maybe even reduce the medication burden. In osteoarthritis, the evidence is actually very strong for symptoms. So in 2023, there was a meta-analysis that looked at 9 randomized controlled trials, and it involved over 2,000 participants. They found that omega-3 supplementation produced a small but statistically significant reduction in pain, joint function, compared with placebo. And this was without increasing adverse events, so it's quite safe to take. Most trials here use fish oil, providing approximately 1 to 3 grams per day of combined EPA and DHA. So they are types of fatty acids that produce the anti-inflammatory effects in our diet. But of course, not everyone can or wants to take fish oil, and this isn't the only option for getting omega-3s in the diet. There are certain plant foods that are rich in something we call ALA, a different type of omega-3. So this can be found in your chia seeds, your flax seeds, hemp seeds, walnuts. So just know when we're talking about nuts and seeds, it's because of these fats that are found in them, they can be quite beneficial. And it's including these foods regularly that can help with overall joint health. If we zoom out and we consider overall dietary patterns, this is where the evidence becomes very compelling. So there have been many studies that suggest a good quality diet can make a real difference for people with rheumatoid arthritis. There have been multiple trials of vegan and whole food plant-based diets, which have found not only reductions in disease activity scores, but improvements in joint pain, swelling, and overall physical function. Many people are part of these studies even report meaningful improvements in quality of life, which is such an essential part of arthritis management. When we look at the bigger picture, a 2025 systematic review examined 15 studies. It included 9 randomized controlled trials, plus cohort and cross-sectional studies. And they found that several plant-forward dietary patterns, such as Mediterranean, vegan, and low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets were generally effective in reducing that rheumatoid arthritis severity. There hasn't been any single diet that's proven to be superior to one another, but it's overall telling us it's about the composition of the diet, and I'll go through what that means very shortly. Across these studies, improvements were seen in subjective measures like pain scores, morning stiffness, and disability, and objective measures such as disease activity and inflammatory markers. So, in other words, the benefits aren't just about how people feel and what they're reporting on that, they're measurable in the body's inflammatory response. Even small pilot interventions, such as the Mediterranean diet trial, in women with rheumatoid arthritis, they reported improvements in pain, disability, morning stiffness, and broader quality of life measures. We have a clinical trial underway, which is testing a 100% plant-based diet over 16 weeks with disease activity and quality of life as the main outcomes. Because this study is still in the works, we don't have any findings to report on, but we can expect even more clarity from this soon. So, what this is telling us, again, it's not about a single nutrient or a single food that's driving these effects. It's likely the overall dietary pattern. Diets rich in plants, fiber, antioxidants, unsaturated fats, appear to shift the body's inflammatory environment in a meaningful way with people with an inflammatory disease like rheumatoid arthritis. And that's a really powerful message, is that dietary change is something we can actually use in clinical practice to support people with rheumatoid arthritis alongside the medications and the other treatments. So, what should we be eating in a plant-forward diet? And this pyramid is such a good reference. You can see such a strong focus on vegetables, fruits, then whole grains and legumes. And to increase the nutritional value and density of the meal, we can consider how food is paired. I'll talk about that shortly. This dietary pattern goes beyond simply supporting joint health, but it's about actively targeting the underlying drivers of chronic inflammation by prioritizing the fiber, the polyphenols, the prebiotics, and probiotics. It's about nourishing the gut microbiome, strengthening immune regulation, and calming that persistent low-grade inflammatory activity. You can see there's a bit more emphasis on fermented foods such as sauerkraut, kimchi, miso, tempeh, kombucha, all which are foods that can provide beneficial live cultures that support microbial diversity in the gut. So if you think back to what I was saying about, supporting beneficial bacteria, these are key players in that. Protein-rich foods such as legumes, tofu, fish, eggs, yogurt, and lean poultry provide dietary factors like amino acids that are needed for maintaining structures like muscle, repairing tissues, and supporting immune function. Now, plant-forward protein sources such as lentils, chickpeas, black beans, tempeh, edamame, nut seeds can also provide these amino acids, but they also deliver the fiber and other nutrients that help regulate other metabolic processes in the body, like blood sugar levels, if that's a challenge for you. They can help with supporting overall metabolic health, which is linked back to inflammatory processes. But unlike many animal protein sources, plant proteins are naturally low in saturated fats. So including a variety of plant proteins across a day can ensure that adequate amino acid intake while reinforcing that gut health, supporting muscle preservation and long-term resilience in the context of chronic inflammation. So we could spend a lot of time unpacking the research behind this way of eating, but what really matters is this composition, how it all comes together. You don't actually need to be perfect to reap these benefits. You can absolutely start with simple, practical changes, such as I always use these examples of making extra virgin olive oil your primary added fat when you're cooking or dressing salads. Letting vegetables take center stage at every meal and experiment with them as well. Season with herbs and spices instead of salt. That can make a big difference, especially if you're watching your sodium intake. Including legumes a few times each week and making sure they're paired with whole grains like brown rice, quinoa, barley, and choosing whole grain breads if you can and if it's tolerated, and letting plant-based proteins take the lead sometimes. Many people think eating plant forward means going completely vegetarian or vegan, But that's not necessary to see real health benefits. Even small gradual changes can make a real big difference to weight management, inflammation, heart health, joint function. Plant forward essentially means making plants the main focus of your meals as opposed to eliminating all your animal products altogether. So, for example, lunch could be a large salad or a grain and bean bowl with a small piece of chicken or fish on the side. Dinner could be a vegetable stir fry with tofu and lentils with a smaller serving of meat if you wish to keep meat in your diet. The idea is that the plants are the center stage of the meal. They're there to provide you the fiber, the antioxidants, and all those beneficial compounds we are talking about. Protein adequacy. Protein is so important when it comes to maintaining muscle mass, supporting joint function, and just overall recovery, all of which are important if you struggle with arthritis, particularly in the knees, hips, and lower back. Inadequate protein can lead to many challenges with overall health and well-being, but particularly muscle loss, weaker joints, and slower recovery from flare-ups or physical activity. When it comes to the plant-based protein, this is where variety really matters. So most plant proteins are missing one or more essential amino acids to make it a complete protein source. So this is why we emphasize a lot on pairing foods correctly and of course seeking guidance to do this. So pairing legumes with whole grains is a good example. It's really important that you have a complete protein source to support that muscle rebuilding and repair. Eating a mix of beans, lentils, grains, nuts, seeds ensures your body gets all the building blocks it needs for that muscle and joint repair. Each protein source, it does offer different nutrients. So lentils and beans, they offer protein, but also iron, folate, fiber. Tofu offers calcium. Nuts and seeds offer vitamin E and omega-3s in addition to protein. So I guess not only is it important from a nutritional perspective to get that variety in, but I always talk about long-term sustainability. Variety is what keeps the meals interesting. It keeps it enjoyable. And in the long run, that's what makes it easier to stick with. And so there's so many different ways to incorporate variety, mixing the different legumes throughout the week, maybe chickpeas one day, black beans another, alternating the protein sources, so tofu, tempeh, edamame, adding nuts or seeds where you can. You can use them as toppings for salads, oatmeals, maybe yogurts. If you eat animal products and that's where you prefer to get your protein from, rotating those lean meats, the eggs, the fish, it's always good to rotate and cycle them instead of relying on one source. Nutrient and mind absorption. So it's not just about what you eat. I always say it's about how your body absorbs the nutrients as well. So some plant-based nutrients, especially nutrients like iron, calcium, and zinc, are less easily absorbed than their animal-based counterparts. So by pairing certain foods thoughtfully, you can maximize the benefits of a plant-forward diet. For bone and joint support, making sure calcium-rich foods are paired with vitamin D could be important. So, for example, if you consume only plant-based meals and that's all you can tolerate, you can opt for fortified soy, oat milk, or almond milk and see if it contains high amount of calcium, but also vitamin D. Leafy greens like kale, bok choy, broccoli could be lightly sauteed with olive oil to maximize the nutrients in them as well. Plant-based iron can be found in your beans, your lentils, your spinach, but non-heme iron is always going to be absorbed way better when it's paired with vitamin C rich foods. So you can think citrus, bell peppers, tomatoes, strawberries, kiwi. So practical examples here off the top of my mind could be lentil soup with chopped tomatoes, chickpea salad with kiwi, spinach stir fry with bell peppers. But why iron really matters is because fatigue is such a big challenge in arthritis management, particularly for those living with rheumatoid arthritis or psoriatic arthritis. Adequate iron is absolutely crucial for energy, immune function, and just supporting healthy muscles. The good thing about iron is we can check those levels and we can see where they're at, and we can increase those iron levels through food. Some other general tips for better nutrient absorption: you can soak or sprout beans, lentils, grains to reduce something called phytic acid. These can block mineral absorption like calcium, which is essential for your bone health. Cooking leafy greens lightly with olive oil. Sometimes, if you're following a strict low fat diet, and maybe that's part of a weight loss intervention, we forget these are actually important to help absorb fat soluble vitamins like your vitamin A, D, E, K. So it's always going to be beneficial to include small amounts of healthy fats. And of course, practicality matters and personalizing your approach. So, as always, you do need to consider allergies, intolerances, cultural preferences, and overall lifestyle. Food, I always say, should be flexible, it should be enjoyable, but it should be tailored to you, which is why it's so valuable to speak with a dietitian or a health professional. So, research into the world's blue zones, we're talking places like Ikaria in Greece, Okinawa, Sardinia, Nicoya, and Loma Linda, show that people in these areas tend to live longer, stay mentally sharp, and remain active in their communities. So, scientists believe these outcomes aren't just about genetics, but um, they are a result from a combination of heavily plant-based diets, daily movement, and strong social connections. Interestingly, these practices already align closely with what arthritis and rheumatology guidelines recommend for managing symptoms and reducing disease risk. So the blue zones, if you're not familiar with them, are known for very high proportions of healthy older adults and lower rates of major chronic diseases. So cardiovascular disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancers. When you compare them with typical Western populations, even when exact longevity numbers are debated, the lifestyle patterns are consistently associated with healthier aging and lower age-related disease burden. So, for example, there was a US study in a community known for long, healthy lives. If anyone's heard of the Adventist community, they found that people there experienced hip fractures about 12 years later than average. It was suggesting that their bones and joints stayed stronger for longer. Then we have population level data from Icaria and other Mediterranean regions that show long-term adherence to a Mediterranean-style diet. A pattern very similar to the blue zones is linked with better metabolic health, lower uric acids, and reduced risk of conditions and flare-ups like gout, which may also indirectly protect the joints. So from a nutrition perspective, it's really important to know that chronic low-level inflammation and oxidative stress play a major role in most types of arthritis, but particularly osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. There's been large global studies that have consistently highlighted inflammation-related risk factors like obesity and smoking, but now we're seeing more emphasis on the diet and lifestyle, and the importance of supporting metabolic health. So the takeaway is really simple here. Adopting an anti-inflammatory lifestyle, eating more plants, staying active, managing stress, avoiding smoking can overall help with reducing inflammation in the body. It may help with slowing biological aging and lower the risk of many age-related conditions, including arthritis. So we don't have direct comparisons of arthritis rates in the blue zones versus other regions. The potential benefits are suggested by the healthy lifestyles people follow there and the patterns in, I guess, observed in other chronic diseases and a few arthritis specific studies. So if you want to look at practical steps you can take and you are feeling inspired by the blue zones for your joint health, these are just a few key principles that could help make it a little bit easier. So making legumes your daily focus, including lentils, chickpeas, black beans, or soy at just 1 to 2 meals per day. Examples of doing this could be think soups, stews, bean and vegetable bowls, grain salads. Um, I guess that's not going to be appropriate for everyone, particularly if you live with a disease like diverticulitis. That's always going to be best discussed with your dietitian. But evidence does show that the regular legume intake can help with other things like supporting blood sugar level stability, reducing inflammation, and even maintaining a healthy weight. Adjusting meal structure, if anyone's ever tried this, but making breakfast and lunch your larger meals. So think oats with fruit and nuts or a grain and bean salad, and then keeping dinner lighter. So focusing more on vegetables, legumes, and smaller servings of protein. So there's been a lot of research around meal timing and portioning. It does suggest that, I guess you can call it front loading the calories, focusing on getting them more in the earlier parts of the day can help maintain energy and support gut health for later in the day. Practicing mindful eating, something so simple yet overlooked. Serving slightly smaller portions and eating slower. We've done previous webinars that have focused specifically on this, but mindful eating practices have been linked to lower caloric intake, better digestion, and reduced joint strain. And that's indirectly from being able to manage the excess weight. So limiting meat and processed foods, so keeping meat to 2 or fewer times per week, enjoying sweets or refined snacks occasionally, embracing lifestyle habits beyond diet. So prioritize daily movement where you can, walking, gardening, light resistance activities, building strong social connections. So maybe even inviting family over for dinner, friends, getting involved with your community groups. Movement and social engagement are linked to many, many health benefits, but definitely improve joint function, mood, and resilience to chronic pain. So again, it's one thing to talk about the principles, the research, and trying to note down all these key targets. Sometimes it can be helpful to see examples of what this looks like in the day. So I've got simple, tasty, realistic examples on the screen here. You can see I've got breakfast is avocado and tahini on whole grain toast. You've got the fiber from the whole grains, healthy monounsaturated fats from the avocado, and calcium and plant-based fats from the tahini. Simple, satisfying, effective. For lunch, you can think salmon with rice and plenty of vegetables. And for dinner, something like gado gado, which is a very plant-forward dish packed with steam or lightly cooked vegetables, tofu, eggs. And you can see there's nothing extreme here, nothing complicated, just balanced whole foods that are working together to support joint health. And these recipes are taken from the Heart Foundation. They have a fantastic database of recipes you could easily look at. So that brings us towards the end of the session. You can, I guess, what I hope we've taken away from today is that a plant-forward eating pattern rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, it provides many beneficial nutritional constituents, antioxidants and phytonutrients, which all have ways of supporting anti-inflammatory processes in the body. And it's not about making huge changes in your day, but it's a small shifts that build up and can make a real big difference. And it's always going to be essential if you're focusing on increasing plants, aiming for that variety, maximize the colors on your plate, and go for minimally processed foods where you can. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to open up the floor to some questions. I've seen some come through, and I'm just going to pause the recording for now.